Welcome to Singh-Ray's webinar of the month with Colleen, Miniuk. We're talking about visualization today, picturing your picture before you make it. By way of introduction, Colleen Miniuk is a corporate America escapee turned full-time outdoor photographer, writer, publisher, instructor, and speaker from Chandler, Arizona. With her work, she aims to encourage appreciation for our wild lands and waterways and inspire others to enjoy adventures in the great outdoors. Her credits include National Geographic calendars, Arizona highways, AAA Via, National Parks Traveler, On Landscape, and a broad variety of other editorial and commercial publications. She has served 3 times as an artist in residence with Acadia National Park, after which she authored the award-winning guidebook, Photographing Acadia National Park, The Essential Guide to When, Where, and How. She's also the author of Wild in Arizona, Photographing Arizona's Wildflowers, A Guide to When, Where, and How, as well as the instructional ebook, Seeing the Light in Outdoor Photography. She writes a popular online photography advice called Dear Bubbles and is currently penning her first travel adventure memoir called Going with the Flow. Colleen is just as excited to help others learn photography as she is in making her own images. She proudly leads photography workshops, women's photography retreats called Sheography, webinars and online critique sessions for camera clubs, organizations, and private clients across the US. When she is not photographing, writing, or teaching, she's likely stand-up paddleboarding, camping, making sand or snow angels, or taking adult ballet lessons. And as she says, you can sleep when you're dead. So we're so excited to have you here tonight, Colleen.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Michelle. I'm so excited. Thanks so much to Singh-Ray Filters for hosting me tonight. And thanks to everybody. We've got a big crowd tonight, and I'm really excited that everybody's here and excited about visualization. Should we get started?
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right, so let's get this kicked off. So today I am going to be talking about what visualization is, what picturing your picture means before you photograph it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it isn't. I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits of incorporating the visualization process into your photographic approach. And I'm going to go into a bit of detail about how I approach this myself in my own work, how I try to build muscle memory when I'm not out in the field, when I'm at home or I'm on the road. I'm not necessarily photographing, but what I can do or what you can do to incorporate visualization when you don't have a camera in your hand. I am going to talk a bit about how we use visualization to approach a scene to make more meaningful photographs, images that we get excited about, images that we're proud about. That's why we're photographing, right? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about critiquing your work. That's the final step in visualization, and I'll show you how it all ties together. But first, I want to kind of level set and make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about. So visualization, per its definition by Merriam-Webster, is the act or process of interpreting in visual terms or in putting into visible form. In other words, it's really daydreaming about our photographs. And I have to be honest, I started daydreaming about photography and all of the places that I could go and all of the beautiful, like Grand Canyon and the Oregon coast and all of these wonderful places while I was sitting in a cube working in corporate America. I'm an ex-software engineer and turned full-time freelance photographer now as of 2007. But when I first picked up that camera in 2001, I spent a lot of time on my desk daydreaming about the kind of photographs that I would be making on the weekend or maybe on vacation. And not only was it a great way to escape office life, but it also helped my photography. And there's been lots of studies that have shown that visualization can make a really big impact in our lives. And ultimately, I'm going to talk about how it can impact our photography. But there's been a lot of visualization studies, and one of the very first ones occurred in the 1960s. It has since been repeated, but the first one was by a gentleman named Alan Richardson. He was an Australian psychologist. He published his results in Research Quarterly in 1967. And what he did is he devised this experiment where he had 3 different groups. And the first group practiced free throws for 20 minutes a day, each and every day for 20 days. The second group visualized making free throws every day for that same duration for the 20 days, but they didn't touch a basketball. They didn't go to the gym. They didn't stand on a free throw line. They just pictured it in their minds, in their head. And then the third group did absolutely nothing. They didn't go to a gym. They didn't touch a basketball. They didn't even think about free throws. And what Alan Richardson did and his group did was tested the three groups on the first day and the last day. And what they wanted to see is what kind of improvement each of these groups made. Well, as you can imagine, if you practice every day, you're going to get better at something. That's whether it's free throws or it's photography. If you have the ability to go out and make photographs each and every day, you're going to see an improvement. And in fact, Alan Richardson and his team found that folks that practice free throws for just 20 minutes a day had a 24% improvement. That's pretty decent. And not surprisingly, the third group who did nothing got nothing. They didn't see any improvement at all. And what was curious about the study is what happened with this middle group. The ones that visualized thought about making a free throw, but actually didn't touch a basketball, didn't actually go and practice, but they did in their own heads. And so what they found is that visualization is almost as good as the actual real deal. So the question to all of you is, how many of you go out and photograph every single day? I don't, and it's my full-time job. I am visualizing almost every waking hour, though. I am visualizing constantly. And I'd like to believe it's a really good use of my over-analytical personality anyway. But it turns out that photographers aren't the only ones who visualize. You may have seen athletes visualize in the Olympics this summer, maybe gymnasts closing their eyes, going through their routines on the sideline before they get on an apparatus. Cinematographers don't start to make movies before they have a screenplay. They have an outline of what they're trying to accomplish. Architects do the same thing with blueprints. There isn't probably a home builder out there that would build a house without a blueprint, right? Software engineers, I used to create use cases. I used to design systems before we did any sort of coding. So there was lots of visualization going on. And if any of you like to cook, perhaps you consult recipes. You look at a recipe, you try to follow it, maybe you deviate from it. You've probably visualized if you've ever gone to the grocery store with a shopping list. How many of you have ever done that, right? You go in and you think about what you want to have for dinner. Maybe you'd like to, figure out what you want for a snack the next day. And so you go into the grocery store with a list, right? But then what happens when you get to the store? The strawberries look amazing. Well, that wasn't on your list. The wine's on sale. Well, that wasn't on your list either. And so that's how I want you to think about visualization in terms of photography, is having a plan, having an outline of what you're trying to accomplish, having a vision, but being open to the spontaneous opportunities that are presented to you in the current moment, in the present moment. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I approach that in just a bit. The visualization, the benefits, not only are you developing your brain for the big game, you're building muscle memory, you're also developing self-confidence. And so what happens is when we get into a location, perhaps in the Foothills Parkway in Tennessee, I was just in the Smoky Mountains with a couple of workshops groups. And when the light hits, or when this moment hits, we don't want to be thinking about, oh my goodness, what should my shutter speed be? What ISO should I be at? Our brain should already be trained to respond to that moment, because some of these moments, they're fleeting, right? Like if we have a jaguar crossing the road under a double rainbow, we don't want to stop and think about, do we have the right settings? And so what we do is we think about those things before they happen. That's what visualization is. And in doing that, it gives us more confidence when we're in the field that we can respond to these spontaneous moments. We are prepared for whatever Mother Nature deals us. And when I talk about visualization, I'm going to talk about putting together a vision, if you will, a title, a haiku, a poem, whatever, a direction. And that direction, that intent, if you will, seeds all of our technical decisions. That's composition. It's what settings we use. It's how we're going to process the image. It's how we present an image. All of those things are based on having a solid visualization. I'll talk a little bit about how we get there. And the other thing that I like about visualization and incorporating it into my own process is that I feel it leads to more personal photographs. What happens is the process, as you'll see, relies upon the existing raw materials in your brain. So I'm not necessarily I've never seen this particular waterfall in the Great Smoky Mountains before, but I have seen plenty of water. I have seen waterfalls before, and I'm sure that you have too. And all of that previous experience is going to help us develop a visualization. We're going to bring out our tastes. We're going to bring out our interests. We're going to bring out what worked and what didn't work from before. And we will build a more meaningful and a more emotional connection with our subject matter. And I think that's why I love photographing, right? Is because I love being outside and I love having that connection with the landscape. And I'm going to assume that you're in the same boat. You enjoy being outside and you want to connect with the landscape in the only way that you know how. And so the great thing about visualization and the process that I'll introduce tonight is that it becomes more powerful and nuanced as you mature and learn and experience. As you grow as a human being, your raw material base grows. And so that's what we want to try to do, is build our raw materials and facilitate this process, this visualization process. So Ansel Adams suggested that visualization, and he was one of the early ones who adopted this approach, the entire emotional mental process of creating a photograph, the ability to anticipate a finished image before making the exposure so that the procedures employed will contribute to achieving the desired result. And so what that means for me, I've tied visualization-driven processes, my visualization-driven process, to the Wallace model of creativity. And this is a standard process that creative experts agree help facilitate creative ideas, not just in photography, but creativity in general. And so the 4 steps are preparation, incubation, inspiration, illumination, and verification. And how I translate that into my own photography when it comes to visualization is there's a pre-visualization step. That's preparation. That's everything that we come across in life. That's all of the external stimuli that we feed our brains. It's everything we look at everywhere in the world. It's not just photography. And then we visualize. And incubation for me really has 2 stages. The first is that we think, which I'm very good at. And then we have to stop thinking. We have to turn our brains off to let our brains do what we've trained it to do. And that takes a little bit of practice. But these 2 steps, preparation and incubation, the pre-visualization stage and the visualization stage, happen in 2 different times. They happen in life. So I'm collecting ideas all the time and I'm visualizing photographs without being in the field. I'm in Truckee, California right now, and I'm not necessarily photographing, but I'm thinking about photographing here and what I might do with this beautiful place. And then when I get into the field, I repeat these 2 processes. I repeat preparation. I repeat incubation. I fill my brain with knowledge and ideas when I get into the field by taking inventories and being mindful and using my words to help shape a title or maybe a haiku or a poem. But then I have to visualize, I have to put together the composition that I'm seeing out in the field. I have to make an arrangement in my brain so that I know what lens to use, where to stand, what filters I might use so that I can execute when I see the aha moment happen. When I get to a point where I say, oh my goodness, I'm so excited about this particular thing or this particular subject, or look at that. That's the aha moment. And that's when we create the image, and hopefully an image that we're excited about. And the last stage is verification, which is post-visualization. Minor White called this post-visualization. And this is where we would critique our work. Did the idea work? Did what we think about come to fruition? And if it didn't, how might we take it a different direction? And how we might polish the image into something that we wish to present to the world. And so the thing about preparation, incubation, inspiration, illumination, and verification is it looks like a very linear process. It looks like a very straightforward process. But in fact, as you're going to see here in a minute, our brains are a very messy place. So all of this can overlap. You can be in verification and get new ideas at any time. So this is kind of a circular process, if you will. There's a lot going on. And what I'd like to do is go through an example of a photograph that I just made this October in the Great Smoky Mountains, but how it started. And it started about 2 years ago, not quite 2 years ago, but pretty close to 2 years ago. And that's what I want to emphasize is visualization sometimes takes some time. And you'll see, hopefully through this example, that it can yield some really interesting results. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is preparation, collecting ideas from anywhere and everywhere. And this starts with an idea. You can get ideas from anywhere and everywhere. And I would encourage to look for things that inspire you. Social media is a phenomenal place to get ideas. And as a confession, when I'm on social media, I'm running through this process with your images. I'm getting an idea and perhaps I'm analyzing it to see what I might do with it. I don't want to copy what you've already done, but I certainly want to get some ideas for my own work. And so you could start with an idea, though, on social media, maybe someone else's photograph. You could be in the grocery store. You could be looking at the pattern on the floor in a conference room. In my case, I had an inspiration. I had an idea when I saw a painting hanging in my hotel room in Florida in February of 2020. And I saved this. I took a snap of it with my iPhone, and you can see it's not a photograph that I would ever show outside of an instructional situation such as this, but I saved it to my inspiration from everywhere. I have a photo album on my phone that I use to collect ideas that I get excited about. And then what we do that's preparation. So I've got this idea, I've got this painting on the wall that I think is pretty cool. The first thing that came to mind is that the little circle is called a bouquet. It had never occurred to me that those look like bubbles. And I thought, oh my goodness, and I love bubbles. For those of you who know me, I go crazy over bubbles. So I saw this painting and was like, oh my goodness, I love that it looks like a bunch of bubbles. And so how would I photograph this? If this were the exact scene that I was presented out in the wild, in the landscape, what would I do with it? And so we start with the idea and then we start thinking. We start think. How do I feel about this? Well, it was pretty interesting. It's minimalistic. What new insight could you bring to the subject or the scene? Well, I don't really photograph much grass, but I hadn't really thought about it until this particular painting. And then I started asking a bunch of what if questions. And this is where something called dry shoot comes in, where Ansel Adams coined this term, dry shoot. It's where we create a photograph in our brain without having a camera in our hand. And so I literally start creating a photograph in my mind, and I start thinking about the quality of light, the direction of light, how I might compose things, what equipment I might use, and how might I use processing software to polish the image. And so here's an example. These are the things that were going through my head when I saw this painting. I would probably, if this were my scene, I would want a macro or a long telephoto lens to isolate those blades of grasses. And I would want to keep my lens parallel with the grass blades so that I could keep both of them in focus. It looks like both of them are in focus in this painting, but I would want to make sure that in my photograph, that's what I do. In order to get that bokeh effect, in order to blur the background and get those circles in the background, I would need a very wide open aperture, which I would get with my macro or my long telephoto lens, somewhere maybe around an f2.8, maybe an f4, depending on which lens I was using, but I would definitely want a wide aperture. And I'd want a sharp blade of grass, which means if the wind's blowing, I'm gonna need a fast ISO and shutter speed. And that could mean ISO 200, 800, 1/100th of a second. And again, I don't have a camera in my hand for this. I'm just making all of this stuff up. And so I look at the scene and I think I would need backlight, maybe back to side light. So I'd want to position myself accordingly so that I put my lit subject against a dark background. Yes, this is all that goes in my head when I'm not actually photographing. And then I think about, okay, so it's green grass. I wouldn't be able to photograph green grass in winter or late fall. So we definitely would need a spring or a summer time frame. And then I'd really want to change up where the X is, where the placement of the grass is, where they crisscross. I might want to do I don't know if I'd want to put it lower or higher. Again, I'm just playing with the idea in my head. All of these are right answers. Maybe none of them are right answers. I'm just making this up at this point. I'm just creating something in my head. And then I'm thinking, well, I really like the visual tension, the drama that the vertical orientation presents. I'd probably keep it in vertical orientation, although I wouldn't be opposed to trying it horizontal to create a little bit more peacefulness in the scene. It's green grass, green is very peaceful. So, so I'm sitting in a hotel room waiting for a presentation to start, and this is what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about making a photograph. And then what happens is I stop thinking. Alan Richardson said, the most effective visualization occurs when the visualizer feels and sees what he is doing. So when you are visualizing at home or you're in your car or wherever, not with the camera in your hand, make it as vivid and as real as you possibly can. Put yourself in the field to the best of your ability. Feel the wind, feel the sun, change the situation, and that's going to train your brain to respond to the situations that you may get yourself into later. So, as I said, I think, and then I just stop thinking. So in February of 2020, I stopped thinking about that painting entirely. And so that painting, that picture of the painting went on my phone, and I literally just forgot about it until I went out on a camping trip in July, later that summer in July of 2020. But I didn't actually go out to photograph. And that's an important thing, I think, when it comes to visualization, is letting your brain put the picture together for you. You have to trust the process, but it happens, it works. In order for your brain to put a photograph together, it has to be relaxed. And this is something Albert Einstein called effective abstention. And what he was really driving at was mental relaxation, so not thinking about anything at all. Think about how many great ideas you get in the shower. That's mental relaxation. Distraction is conscious mental work on other problems. So I tend to get very good ideas when I'm driving, and I'm actually focused on a different task. Albert Einstein also had this other idea called combinatory play, the act of opening up one mental channel by dabbling in another. And when I went out camping in Utah in the summer of last year, I was not going out to make photographs. I was actually going out to write. I was actually going out to relax, but I was also going out to just get some time to work on my memoir. In other words, don't think about making a photograph. That is very important when we talk about visualization. Your brain, trust your brain. Have confidence that your brain will do the work for you. And it most certainly does if you're relaxed, if you're paying attention to something else. Distract your brain. So when I was sitting out in the field, I was just writing, as you can see my laptop, I was sitting in a field of grass and beautiful trees. I wasn't thinking about making a photograph. And I just happened to check Instagram. And yeah, social media is a great place to get ideas. And I sure did. If you aren't familiar with Deborah Hughes's work, I would highly recommend checking her out. She had a post she had this abstract where it was intentional camera movement and multiple exposures at the same time. And I had never thought about something like that. It just never had crossed my mind. But as soon as I saw her Instagram post, I immediately thought about this blade of grass and what I might be able to do with it. I was sitting in front of a whole field of grass, and I said, I wonder what if I did this? And so Deborah Hughes and her post was the idea, that's preparation. And then I had a recollection back from that February timeframe of what I might be able to do with grass, because I had the opportunity right in front of me, and I started incubating. And so when we go into the field and we bring these ideas into the field, first thing we want to do is we don't want to shoot. If you are going to think about anything, and I have to admit, I don't think about a whole lot when I'm out photographing. When I'm actually in the moment, the aha moment is happening, I'm not thinking a whole lot. But if you're going to think about anything, if you're not feeling it, you're not sure what you should focus on, don't focus on photographing. Focus on taking inventories instead. Be a collector of information, be a gatherer of ideas and knowledge. Get to know your location, in other words. And I do 5 different inventories. So the first is visual inventory. So a literal identification of visual elements. There's grass, there's trees, there's gamble oak, there's concrete, very, very literal. And then I start thinking about spatial relationships. So it looks like the grasses are in front of the trees, and that may affect my depth of field, for example. What is the relationship between what I'm actually seeing? And then there's temporal or time-based information. What time of day is it? It was probably about 9-10 o'clock in the morning. The lighting conditions, you can see the sun is coming from the right-hand side. It's kind of grazing across the grass. It's spring, it's summer. In this case, I was very excited. I had my green grass. I was like, ooh, I might be able to pull this off. And then sensory is the fourth stage of the fourth type of inventory. So perceptions come from all of our senses, not just from sight. So we trigger memories, we trigger emotions through perceptions and sensory information. And then the last type of inventory is inner emotions and meaning. And for me, all of this was just getting a sense of what cards I had been dealt. What do I have to work with here right in front of me? And how can I best put this together right here, right now, using the inspiration that I have from Deborah Hughes and that painting on the wall in Florida. And so when we are out in the field, we want to pay attention to ourselves. We want to use mindfulness. We want to be aware of what is happening in the present moment, not what we think should be happening. And that sometimes that gets in the way. Sometimes our preconceived notions or previous visualizations that we did at home can lead to expectations. And sometimes they guide us in ways that maybe are not really what's happening in the present moment. And so I try to use words. I try to describe what I'm responding to and why. And so I obviously was very excited that there were a bunch of blades of grass out there. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to try recreating that painting that I saw in February. And when I saw it, I was like, wah, 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 like this is super boring. And this is not what's happening right here, right now. What I'm feeling is the wind blowing against my skin, and I feel movement, and I feel the sway of the grass. And if I'm using words like sway of the grass, this photograph is not it. So while that might be a right answer, it didn't fit my visualizations. It fit my previous visualizations, but I was sitting in there in the moment. I was feeling the grasses. I was feeling the movement. And so I decided to do intentional camera movement, which is something Deborah Hughes introduced in my brain, right, as I saw her Instagram post. So I decided to do multiple exposures. I moved my camera during the middle of the exposure on these trees. I moved it with a slow shutter speed from top to bottom. And then I did another one from side to side, and I overlaid my images. And I'm going to actually talk through that technique here in just a second. So if it's not clear, I'm going to go through it very, very specifically here in the photograph that I ended up using. This photograph was not what I was excited about. I liked that it looked like plaid. I thought that was pretty cool. It looked like a tartan to me, this, Scottish tartan, but the trees weren't bending, and I was feeling the swaying of the grasses. The trees were not swaying. The trees are very structured. They're very stiff. They're very static. And so when you are photographing, part of the visualization process is verifying, did the idea work? You have a visualization, grass is swaying, for example. Is it working? And if you like something in the photograph, then keep it. I loved the tartan. I loved that pattern. So that's what I was going to keep. What I didn't like about the photograph is that the trees were too static. So I needed to get rid of the trees and try something else. And so we keep doing that until we keep repeating this process until what we think we are seeing, what our intent is, actually comes out of the camera. And it does. Use your failures, if you want to call them failures, use your frames to guide you through to polish your visualization, and eventually you will get there. And so what I did is I said, okay, well, I love the idea of tartan, but I need to focus on the grasses. So I started putting together a haiku because I wasn't quite sure where I was going with this. And for those of you who maybe have forgotten about a haiku is something we did in grade school. If you grew up in America, we were taught this very, very simple process, this very simple poem that is actually quite complex. It's only 3 lines. You only get 3 lines, and it's 5 syllables on the first line, 7 syllables on the second line, and 5 syllables on the third line. Not words, syllables. So very, very short. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to describe what I was experiencing and noticing, and I wanted to understand how I was feeling about it. And you can use this technique for any scene that you have. It's very, very effective. So in this case, I really wanted to polish up what I was responding to, because it obviously wasn't the trees. It was maybe the grasses swaying. And so I wrote, bending in the breeze, the tartan of the wheatgrass, nature leaves her mark. And the thing about writing a haiku, or perhaps titling your photograph before you shoot it, that's a visualization, it's a direction, is that you don't have to be good at this. This does not have to be a perfect poem. You do not have to be a poet laureate. You just got to get the words out. You've just got to understand what it is you're responding to and why. And the haiku is a technique that I've used. A lot of my workshop participants have used it to be successful in understanding what it is they're looking at. What are they experiencing? What are we noticing? And how do we feel about it? Why are we responding to this blade of grass and not those trees? That's important. So in here, there's nothing about the trees at all. It's about the grass. And so I try to match keywords with photographic technique. So there's a couple of words in this haiku that stand out to me. So for example, bending. Bending implies a curve, right? So when I'm looking at grass, I'm looking for a curvature in the wheatgrass. I don't want a straight blade of grass like I tried in that first photograph that I made, right? That's not what I wanted. And then breeze to me implies some movement. So a slow shutter speed, not a fast one. I want to show that movement. And then the tartan is the plaid. So I need to create that pattern by using multiple exposures and using intentional camera movement. And so that's what I started with. And so this became a 3 exposure photograph. And so I titled this Tartan of the Wheatgrass. So this is the very first exposure, and you can see that it's not much of anything. It's not very remarkable at all, but we started with it and we build upon it. And so I was using my Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II with my 14 to 150 millimeter lens at 60 millimeter. Now, because I'm photographing with a Mark II, EM1 Mark II, it's a mirrorless, but it's basically the crop ratio, or the aspect ratio, is 2x. So it's a 28 to 300 millimeter equivalent lens. So this is about 120 millimeter on my focal length. I had an ISO 200 with an f/22 at 1/10 of a second. The 1/10 of a second was slow enough so that I could physically move my camera down from top to bottom in just a field of grass during the exposure. And I did a horizontal orientation. And then in the camera, in my Olympus, there's a function where I can rotate my image in the camera to a vertical. And so that's what I did. And then I made a second exposure similar to the first one. From top, I moved my camera from top to bottom. This is intentional camera movement. I did it vertically, and you can see that I did it right on top of the first image. So I used the overlay function in my camera. Some of you may have that, particularly in the mirrorless cameras. There's a lot of new cameras, the mirrorless that have that function, either in their menu or through your playback function. And then I needed, so this was the foundation for my plaid, the foundation for my tartan, but I needed the wheatgrass. And I wanted the wheatgrass to stand out, so I wanted it in sharp focus. And so this was exposure 3, and you can see that my settings changed a bit. So I went to 150 millimeter focal length, or a 300 millimeter equivalent, ISO 400 at f4.5 at 1/640th of a second. So very, very, very fast. And then I overlaid that on top of the blended images that I had before that. So that was 3 of them. And then in processing later, I increased the contrast so that I had that idea of the tartan or the plaid. I reduced some orange in my white balance. I added a vignette, which I do with a lot of my images to hold the eye into the photograph. And I removed dust spots. And I was thinking about what I was going to do in processing while I was photographing it. So I had already come up with these ideas, these 4 steps, before I brought it home. So it made processing very, very easy. But when I was at home and I was doing verification, I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. Like, I don't know if it's perfect, but I sure liked how it happened. I sure loved the process. I sure had a blast doing it. I should try this again. And that was in July, I think that was at least last summer, July of 2020. And then I stopped thinking about it entirely. And I went on my merry way. And this is what happens when we do visualization, is we feed our brains new ideas. So this was a new idea. And then I stopped thinking about it entirely. Until 15 months later, in October of 2021, when I was with one of my workshop groups, we were out playing. And I was teaching, which is combinatory play for me. I had mental distraction, so I was not in the field to make my own photographs. I was there to help my workshop participants make their own. And I was trying to explain the technique of multiple exposures, intentional camera movement, the one that I've just explained. I was sharing that technique and that idea with them because we had this wonderful palette of trees and fall colors, and it was just beautiful. But I didn't have any intentions of making a photograph. And so this is what happens. I wasn't thinking at all. And so I made one exposure to show the intentional camera movement, which you can see here. I did 2.5 seconds. So that allowed me to not only move my camera from up to down, but I also did what's called a zoom pull, where I had my camera at 25 millimeter initially. And then as the exposure happened, I turned it to 14 millimeter. So you get sort of this little radiation. You can see it sort of in the center in that exposure 1 image. And then I literally turned my camera down to the ground, made a snapshot of it, and blended these 2 images together. And so that's what this ended up, this is what resulted. This is called Falling Dreams. I call this Falling Dreams. And if you know anything about figure-ground relationships when it comes to art and photography and painting, our brains are not able to see a figure in a ground at the same time. There's a bit of an optical illusion with this image. So my brain can't figure out if the leaves are the ground, or the trees in the back are the ground. And so my brain flips from one to the other and back and forth and back and forth. So it's almost an optical illusion. And I thought that was pretty funky. I thought that was pretty cool. So you can see that I did this. I blended the 2 images, and this was in the Great Smoky Mountains. We call that Falling Dreams. So that process, that whole visualization process, took almost 2 years to get to. And it will still pay off in all of the years to come, just from that one idea of the painting and then getting that trigger from Deborah Hughes's Instagram post. So that's feeding your brain knowledge and ideas and letting your brain do the work.
So
now,
Colleen,
yeah.
do you keep any kind of logs or documents to keep track of your visualizations and preparations?
I don't, but my brain is used to it. My brain is used to overthinking. Keeping a log, maybe writing some notes down in your journal or your phone would be a really smart idea as you're starting out with this. This is actually, it's a great timely question. This is what I used to do, this spreadsheet right here. And now I don't do that because my brain's used to it, but absolutely, I would encourage that. Mm-hmm. Are there other questions, Michelle?
We had a question early on about a waterfall shot where you did not use a filter, and someone wanted to know why you didn't use a polarizer on that.
I know I should have used a polarizer, but I was using my 7 to 14 millimeter lens, and it is a bulbous front. And I did not have my filter set up with me at that moment. So I can't put a normal polarizer on a bulbous lens. But yes, a polarizer would have been a good idea for that one. Yep.
So that's it for now.
Perfect. So yeah, so writing down visualizations is a good idea. And I used to do this, as I just mentioned. This is my spreadsheet, my shot list, if you want to call it that, from my second artist in residency in Acadia. And it is the last spreadsheet that I ever put together when it came to visualization. And you'll get why here in a second. So what I did is I had already been to Acadia once in November of 2009. I had the chance to go back in October of 2010. And I was so excited because I knew what I was going to see, right? I was familiar with the location, and I started jotting down all of these notes. And it was like, okay, when I go to Monument Cove, I want fog, and I want a mid to low tide. So I want rocks in the foreground. I want a wide angle lens. I'm going to look, the sun's going to rise through the fog, and it's going to be amazing, right? So when I worked my brain, this is the spreadsheet that I produced before I went on site. You can see that I consulted things like the photographer's ephemeris, where I knew when the moon was rising, what phase of the moon was going to be at 3:49 on the morning of October 5th on line 3. And so I had all of these ideas. And what do you think happened when I got on site? When I got to Monument Cove, it was cloudy and it was high tide, right? Or on the morning of October 5th, it was overcast and I couldn't see the crescent moon. And what happened when I got on site was that I got really, really frustrated. I got very upset that my expectations did not pan out. And I kind of went home a little pouty. And that's not what visualization is supposed to be. It is fine to come up with all of these ideas, but when visualization turns into expectations, we're missing the present moment. And so you can do all of that, just try not to bring the expectation into the field, because it's going to lead to frustration. It's not going to lead to joy and enthusiasm and excitement as photography should. So you can design your shot as you will, but turn your brain off. Think about not making a photograph. Think about collecting inventories and putting together haikus instead, because that's going to distract your brain from the actual act of making a photograph. So as the quote goes, expectation is the root of all heartache. It is unknown and is often misattributed to Shakespeare, but we don't want to be photographing heartache, right? This is supposed to be fun. So we've gone through the process, but I do want to highlight some additional things in the inspiration and the illumination phase, because when we're in the field and the moment is happening, I don't stop visualizing. I continue to visualize, and I'm trying to set myself up for success. I'm trying to actually visualize what I will do with my image once I get it into processing, once I get it into my processing software, once I go home and need to do something with this particular image. So when we're in the field, remember that all of the technical decisions that you make are based off your visual intent, whatever that title is, whatever your haiku is, whatever words you use. It's going to drive what lens you use, what filter to use, where you're going to stand, even how you're going to arrange the trees in your photograph versus the stone in the background. It's going to dictate what exposure settings you're going to use. Like I mentioned earlier, I needed a slow shutter speed, not a fast shutter speed. And so I know that a lot of us have these questions when we get into the field. It's like, okay, what lens do I use? It's like, okay, well, what are you trying to capture? Like, what are you trying to accomplish with this image? And that's where the visualization, that preparation and the incubation really help answer those questions for you very, very easily. And as I'm standing there with my tripod in front of a scene like this in Dinosaur National Monument, I am thinking about how to maximize my data. Oh, sure, I want to make sure my composition's right. I want to make sure it's clean and there's no mergers and things like that. But first and foremost, I am making sure that I have an appropriate amount of data to use in my processing and in my presentation. And I want to talk about some of the things that I visualize in the field that help me later that set me up for success later, and they will help set you up for success later as well. So the first one is histogram. So our histogram can help us visualize the data that we are collecting while we are photographing. And what I'm looking for, I'm shooting in RAW, I am looking for as much data as possible. If you're photographing in JPEG, you're going to look for a histogram that looks a little different. You're going to look for an even distribution of tones towards the center of the histogram. I'm looking for, because I'm trying to maximize my data and I'm photographing in RAW format, I want to shift my histogram to the right as far as possible without blowing out the data. So I want to move, I want to move this histogram as far this way without getting a spike on the right-hand side. That's an indication here that we're blowing out our highlights and we are not recording data in that tone or in that area there in the histogram. So what I'm looking for, our cameras are linear devices, and they record, if you're using a 16-bit camera as I am, they record about 65,000 discrete tonal levels across 12 stops of light. My Olympus camera has a dynamic range of 12 stops of light. That is something that you can look up. And so you divide your histogram into 12 stops of light. And because our cameras are linear devices, all of our cameras are linear devices, whether they're 16-bit or 14-bit we have some differences there, but the numbers may change, but the process and how it distributes these tonal levels is exactly the same. So if you've got a 16-bit camera, our camera records half of the available light in the first stop of light. So right in here, and that's a very slippery slope, right? We don't want to blow out our highlights, but we want to collect half of the available data. And then it's half again, half again, half again, half again, half again, all the way until we get to very, very little data. So I don't want to accidentally or intentionally underexposed because I'm not collecting as much data. I want to push my histogram this way, exposed to the right, ETTR, so that I'm collecting all of this yummy data, right? So what happens though, and this is where people get a little bit mixed up with this technique, is that our photograph, when it comes out of our camera, looks very blah. It looks washed out. And this is where visualization can help you. This is where knowing your camera and knowing what you can do in processing can help you understand that that is the right answer. It's going to look washed out. And the reason it looks washed out, I brought this into Photoshop here, is that you can see we don't have any blacks. So I've pushed the histogram as far to the right as possible, and there are no black tones in this image. And so how we fix that, or how we maximize the data, basically, think about all of that data that we're collecting here. That's a lot of yummy data for us to use in processing. What I do is I use a levels adjustment, and I just move. I want you to watch this black slider right here. I wish I could do a live show on this one, but this will just go through PowerPoint here. Watch that black slider. All I do is I take my black slider and I touch the edge of the histogram, and that stretches the entire tone, all those tones, all that data across the tonal range. And so that's literally the majority of my processing. And I know that I'm going to do this when I'm standing in the field. I know that this is what's going to happen. And so I know for all of my images exposed to the right, and then I make this levels adjustment. And that's literally the extent of my processing for a lot of my images. As you can see, this is from Wares Valley, which is just outside of Smoky Mountains. We were actually standing on our porch in the last hour of our workshop when this happened, and it was absolutely glorious. So we weren't thinking at that moment, we were just photographing, go, 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 go. We knew how to photograph fog. We knew how to expose properly for the fog. We knew that it was going to be a little bit blue. I kept it a little bit blue because I wanted the contrast between the orange and the blue. And I'm thinking about those things when I'm out in the field. The other consideration that I'm making in the field is filter use. And I'm pretty much using a polarizer or a graduated neutral density filter pretty much all of the time, unless I'm photographing backlight or midday, I'm using macro. But if I'm shooting a landscape, I pretty much always have a graduated neutral density filter on or a polarizer. And what I'm trying to do, this is the first image that I made. You can see that the background is blown out. The foreground looks fine. It looks very reasonable, very acceptable. But the background most certainly does not. And my camera just simply did not have the dynamic range that to capture all of the tones in one photograph. It was greater than 12 stops of light. And so that's where the polarizer comes in. It can darken the sky. You can see how it darkened the sky. It enriched, it saturated that blue. And then I put a 4-stop graduated neutral density filter right over the top here. And I probably somewhere put the gradation right somewhere along in here because I wanted to darken that down. And so you can see that the foreground is still properly exposed and now the background is properly exposed. And that's what I want. I want the very best image in the field. And that's what I feel filters like the graduated neutral density filter and polarizer can do for me when I'm out photographing this dramatic light like we had in Dinosaur National Monument this past summer. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm verifying whether the idea worked. And so I'm in the field and I do verification. And I think about what's going to happen when I bring this negative, if you will, this digital image into the digital darkroom. And as Minor White said, when printing a negative, remembering back to the plan for the photograph or when projecting forward to new combinations. So one thing I do want to point out in this whole process of visualization is at any point, you can change your mind. You can change the visualization. And if something's not working, then you can certainly try something else. And so when I made this photograph and I looked at what I was dealt, I saw very dramatic lighting with my own eyes, but I exposed to the right. This is somewhat washed out because I used the exposed to the right technique. I knew that in the processing software that I could adjust for it by simply moving that black slider in the levels adjustment. I also didn't particularly care for the foreground here at the bottom. So I envisioned that I would be darkening this a bit. I would probably remove this by doing what's called a warp. I would pull that out and I would darken some of these areas in here to really make that light and that hoodoo stand out. And so I'm drawing this, I'm essentially thinking about this in the field for my processing. And so this is how I processed it. I'll go back and forth. This is Exhibit A. This was the original raw file. And this is Exhibit B. This is how I addressed the things that I wanted to address in my verification step or in my post-visualization when I was at home using my processing software. So again, using the polarizer and the 3-stop graduated neutral density filter helped retain some of that beautiful texture in the sky. And then using some processing software, I was able to darken the foreground and darken some of the areas that I didn't really want you to pay attention to and lighten the areas that I wanted you to pay attention to. So this is out in Ghost Ranch, New Mexico this past summer. But also verification is not just in the field, it's also when we go home and we start thinking about our work. I love being out in the field, but I also love thinking about the next time I'm going to be out in the field. And so when I review my images, I'm always looking for new ideas and how I might be able to take the things that I've already done and put them into a situation that I might be in later down the road. So this is an image from Acadia National Park from a number of years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago. I call it Ode to Monet. And I was trying to get that idea of the impressionistic Monet lily pad kind of feel. That's the idea. I incubated it and I ended up executing it out in Acadia National Park. But I asked myself, what do I like about it? What don't I like about it? And then I would ask how I would approach it differently if I had the opportunity to photograph lily pads in beautiful reflected light, which is what this is. This is out at the Tarn, for those of you who are familiar with the area. And so I critique this and I try to get new ideas for next time. And then I'm driving around Maine, just driving around Maine. I've got my camera on my car seat. I'm not really thinking about making a photograph, but when I come around the corner and I see a pond of reflected light and it is filled with lily pads, I know exactly what to do with it. And when I saw this at Temple Pond just this October, I turned the car, did a U-turn, pulled over, and I was so excited about this. And I really didn't have to think much. You can see between the two lenses and the exposure, they're similar. I used the polarizer, so same lens, and I used the polarizer to help me execute this particular image. So I had the visualization, I'd worked it, I had critiqued the work, and so I put it in my brain. And so when I saw this scene, I knew exactly what to do with it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. We've covered the visualization process. We've given you an idea of how to incorporate this into your photographic process, whether it be at home or in the field. And so following that Wallace model of creativity, the preparation, incubation, inspiration, illumination, and verification stages, or as I like to say, pre-visualize, visualize, seize the aha moment, and then post-visualize. And what that means, how we feed this process, is that you're collecting ideas from anywhere and everywhere. We want to keep analyzing and turn any random idea into a made-up photograph. So dry shoot, pretend like you're photographing, close your eyes if you're sitting at your desk or in your shower or wherever it may be, and then eventually just stop thinking about it. Don't think about photography. Don't think about recreating that image. And continue to gather and visualize the ideas before you shoot when you arrive on a location. Don't pick up your camera right away, right? Don't grab your camera right out of your bag. Think about it and use your inventories, use words, titles to refine your visualization. What is it that you're responding to and why? And then make the best possible image in camera to facilitate your processing and your presentation later. And as you're processing your images, critique yourself. You can steal, like an artist, from yourself. You can steal ideas to feed from verification into preparation. And if I could sum up visualization, the visualization-driven process in terms of our photography, I think I would use this quote by actor Sean Patrick Flannery. Do something today that your future self will thank you for. And so think about how visualization can be used today or tonight or tomorrow that your future photographic self will thank you for when you end up in some beautiful, remarkable place. There are some resources that I'd like to point you to if you are interested in this topic and you'd like to learn more. Ansel Adams has a series of books. The Negative is one where he introduces the visualization techniques and how we put together an image before we photograph it. Steal Like an Artist is a book by Austin Kleon. He talks a lot about what creative experts encourage, which is collecting ideas from everywhere, and he talks about how to put those together. The next two, The Practice of Contemplative Photography and Photography and the Art of Seeing, are books that will help get you into a more mindful state of thinking, as opposed to, just running out with your camera and spraying and praying and hope that one image comes out. This is a much more mindful way of approaching photography and using the analytical parts of your brain as well as the creative sides of your brain. If you'd like to understand visualization-driven processes in terms of processing, software processing, particularly Photoshop, my buddy Guy Tall has a great book about Landscape Photographer's Guide to Photoshop, and he incorporates a visualization-driven process for processing. So it's a great read. It's very easy to read. You can pick that up. If you want to understand more about what I'm visualizing specifically in terms of composition, last year I was part of a webinar hosted by Singh-Ray, No More Rules, Human Perceptions and Composition, and that is available on YouTube. You can take a look at the kinds of things, the lines, layers, and light that I'm thinking about when I'm approaching a scene. And then in my Dear Bubbles column, which is a column about photography, art, and the creative life, there's 3 different posts that I would point you to. Picture Your Picture, Planning Not to Plan, and Mind Your Monkey Mind. Those 3 will give you a taste of how to incorporate visualization. A lot of the things that I've talked about today, I've covered in those. So if you'd like a reminder, you most certainly can rewatch this video, or you can certainly go to my Dear Bubbles column. And I'll stop here for questions, but if you do like to keep in touch, this is how you can find me. You can sign up for my workshops and my newsletter via my website, colleenminiuk.com. My books, I have multiple guidebooks, and my ebooks are available through my publishing company, Analemma Press. And then you can see me on social media, both Facebook and Instagram. And I do hope that we can keep in touch. And yeah, so thanks everybody for your time. I hope you've gotten some new ideas for incorporating visualization into your photographic process. So I'm going to come out of this.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions. A histogram question. The histogram is really different, RAW versus JPEG, but the viewfinder and a mirrorless must be a processed image. So isn't the histogram truly a JPEG histogram?
Yeah, so when you're looking at the back of your LCD, your camera does not have the processing capability to show the raw histogram. And so it is taking a subset of information. It is taking the JPEG, it's taking the read from the JPEG, which is a compressed file format. So your JPEG, your histogram on the back of your camera might look slightly different when you bring it into processing, but it's not going to be significant. If you've got a substantial amount of data blown out and not being recorded, that's not necessarily, you're not going to save that in Photoshop. So you do want to be mindful of that. But yes, absolutely correct.
And can you elaborate on the Olympus camera 14 to 150, 28 to 300 lens? What file size does this yield?
So my camera, I think, is a 21 megapixel, somewhere around there. It might be just a couple decimal points less than that, but it's around 21 megapixel. And so my 14 to 150 is just an equivalent to a 28 to 300 lens in 35 millimeter. The file size is exactly the same size. It's just the way my camera records data.
Right. And then we have a comment. Colleen, you answered many questions I had in my brain, wanting an answer in camera and post. Thank you.
Oh, good. Excellent to hear.
Lance wants to know, where can I read more about using haikus in the creative process?
Absolutely. I have a Dear Bubbles about the haiku process. If you go to Dear Bubbles, and there's a little, there's a magnifying glass on the top right-hand side. Do a search for haiku and you'll find it. I go through the process very, very much in detail.
And then how much easier is it to visualize photos now that you're traveling a lot compared to when you had to spend all day trapped in a cubicle?
I love that question. I love it. It is much, much easier. It's much more rewarding, obviously, when I have the ability to visualize anytime that I want without the distraction of staff meetings and weekly reports. So I love it. It's great. Yep.
How do you practice at home with your equipment so that you're able to execute your vision when in the field?
Yeah, so when I'm practicing at home, I don't actually touch my equipment. I just simply picture it in my head and I pretend like I've got my camera in my hand. If you want to, you could physically put your camera in your hands. That's awesome. One of the things that you want to do is make sure that you understand your equipment before you go out into the field. So for example, if you were to purchase a brand new graduated neutral density filter and you've never used it before, you'd want to take it out of the case. You'd obviously take the plastic off, put it in front of your camera, play with it, see how it fits in the filter holder, turn it to the left, turn it to the right, see how it moves, see how you can adjust it. Those are things that you'd want to visualize before you go out into the fields, because we don't want to be fidgeting with our equipment. We want to understand it before we get out there. So, yep.
After years of experience with visualization, are you still deliberately, consciously following the steps you shared in the field, or has it become more intuitive?
It's absolutely become more intuitive. And the process that I've outlined today is pretty extensive. I'm not thinking about a whole lot of this anymore. And it's just because I've done it so many times. And that's like anything, right? Anytime you're practicing, it's going to start off a little clunky. It's going to be a little bit weird. But as you get more and more involved with it, as you practice it more, it becomes second nature. You build that muscle memory and you don't think about these things. So just keep practicing. Even if it feels a little weird at first, it becomes very, very intuitive as you do it over and over again. Great question.
And then we had a comment about the histogram. Together with the histogram, you can use the highlight indicator to see what areas of your image are blown out, also known as blinkies. When using blinks and histogram through some experience, you can get a sense of how much you can push the histogram to the right.
Yep. Yeah, the highlight alert and the blinkies will tell you where you're blown out. And that is definitely something you want to pay attention to as you're looking at your histogram. Absolutely. Great. Yep.
And then are you planning on doing more webinars as you did during the worst of COVID?
I am. Yeah, I mean, the best way to get notification, as a lot of you, I think, got notification, is to be on my newsletter. I announce webinars like this and others through my newsletter. That's the best way to do that. Yep.
Is there a common mistake you have made in your process that you can provide advice on so we can avoid the mistake?
Oh, goodness.
The trick interview questions.
Yeah. I mean, arguably, I've made a million mistakes. I'm not sure that there's one in particular. You know what? I think the one that would stand out to me is not being mindful enough of my composition, specifically my cropping, if you will. So I don't crop in processing. By the time I get my images into processing, and I think, by the time I get my images in processing, I have already tagged which photographs I'm going to process. My Olympus has a lock feature, so I tag it. It looks like a key. And so I tag it. And once I tag it, all I'm doing in processing is really working with tonality. Maybe I'll do a little bit of warp, maybe I'll do a little bit of border patrol issue, but it's usually to address something I could not address in the field. And so I would suggest that by the time I get my composition in processing software, I don't want to touch the crop. I'm not cropping for panoramas. I'm not cropping for verticals. By the time I get it there, I have already made that decision. And so what I would suggest is being mindful enough up front so that you don't have to spend a lot of time processing. I think that would be particularly around the cropping, because the cropping, when we crop, we may want more information, less information. And if you're sitting behind your computer, it's very difficult to fix, right? I mean, sometimes you can, but you can't get more or wider scene if you didn't record it when you were in the field. And so for me, I'm very mindful of my composition, and particular my cropping. So I think that's the one thing that I would point out. But understand that the mistakes that you make in the field are ideas, and you're building your knowledge base. So don't be afraid to make mistakes on your own and to learn from them and fill your brain with new ideas. Yeah.
When you are visualizing and you have your ideas about an image, but you take, for example, 500 images in a day, how do you remember what you wanted to achieve in the final post-processing stage? And does the do you process change in the final stage?
Yeah, so that is something that does happen. I don't always shoot 500 images in a day, but sometimes I do. I've gotten to the point where I can, like I said, I tag the images that I know that I'm going to process. And as some of you know from other presentations, that my keep ratio is about 3%. So out of what's 3% out of 500, it's not really, it's not very many. So I'm not dealing with 500 images. I'm really dealing with maybe 20, maybe. And so I know what I'm going to do with those 20. And my brain, this is how I think. I mean, this is I don't want to say it's pretty natural for me, but it is pretty natural for me to remember what I want to achieve for each image. And, a lot of it is I'm exposing to the right. So I know that I'm going to darken, I'm going to move the black point. I know that I'm going to put a vignette on my image. So some of the things are kind of standard, but I think about highlight and shadow a lot. And so some of it is just, it's similar for each image, but I apply it slightly differently. So I'm definitely not dealing with 500 images in my brain. I'm dealing with maybe 10, 20 per day tops. And so that's a lot easier for me to manage.
Right. I think that's it for the questions. Lots of thanks in the chat window. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We appreciate the time that you took out of your day to be here with us. And Colleen, thank you so much for presenting. I think it's been a really interesting topic and the audience has been really engaged and we love that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for your excellent questions. Thank you for Singh-Ray for putting this on and for your support of my work and for my workshop participant support. We're very, very thankful for what you do and you make a difference in my images and others. So thanks so much for doing what you do.
All right. Well, everyone have a great night and we'll see you again next month.
Take care, everybody. Be well.